when people look back in 200 years' time at our culture, whose music will have survived from the 20th century? Who will be our equivalents of Bach and Beethoven, Verdi and Wagner? There are big classical names from the last 100 years, undoubtedly. Schoenberg, Stravinsky, Shostakovich, Stockhausen. But I believe the big story of 20th century music is the way that classical and popular music collided with each other to create a new musical mainstream. The chief architects of this new mainstream absorbed every other style around them in an extraordinary, unprecedented melting pot. They reinvigorated the old Western tradition and embraced new technologies with enthusiasm and imagination. Music could be both genuinely sophisticated and genuinely popular. In the 1960s, with classical music at its lowest ebb, the most important composers in the world were without doubt the Beatles.
The Beatles officially split up in 1970, but the impact their music had is still being felt today and shows absolutely no sign of receding. When they started out, pop music was still in its infancy, belting out a raw and primitive sound. Then along came the Fab Four. They may have revered the previous generation of rock and rollers such as Elvis and Chuck Berry, but what the Beatles were about to do to music was to outstrip their achievements 100-fold. They changed the sound, the form, the ambition, the scale, and the language of popular music. The sheer speed of their development once they got into their stride is staggering. Here they are in 1963 with From Me to You, a bright and breezy love song with a crackingly hummable tune. The line-up and look of the band is typical of pop groups of the time.
I got everything that you want. I got heart that's oh so true. Just call on me and I'll send it along with love from me to you. I got arms that long to hold you.
It's better than most people could write in a lifetime, of course, and its middle section, I've got arms that long to hold you and keep you by my side, has already got more interesting chords in it than most of their chart-topping contemporaries, but nevertheless it's just a good pop sing-along. But here they are just 4 years later in 1967 with Strawberry Fields Forever.
Let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields.
The conventional look and sound of 1963 has disappeared completely, replaced by a more individual and introverted style. Everything about the track is strange and unfamiliar. The shape of its tune, its sound, and its sheer bewildering complexity.
Strawberry Fields Forever.
The chief weapon in their musical counter-revolution was a stunning roll call of sublime melodies that perhaps only Mozart can match in European musical history. It's no accident that Yesterday is the most recorded song of all time. It is that good. But they weren't just about catchy tunes.
To appreciate fully what the Beatles did to music, we need to look at the basic building blocks of all music, melody, rhythm and harmony, and to see why it is that Western music sounds so different to the music of other cultures. A piece of Western music is instantly recognized as such because its tune is constructed from a series of notes which belong to families of notes called keys. Think of them as a palette of available colors, if you like. Since the list of available colours is in fact fairly restricted, these notes arrange themselves time and time again into familiar and attractive patterns, which composers over the centuries have discovered work well. Until the 20th century, that is, when classical composers decided to dismantle this system of agreed note patterns altogether, deliberately. They were fed up with tunes sounding predictable and familiar and thought it best to destroy the old note system completely. One result of this movement is that for the first time in history, a huge gulf opened up between music lovers and music, because audiences couldn't identify in any way with the new sound. Popular music, on the other hand, stuck to the old note system with a vengeance. Classical and popular music were drifting further and further apart, but worse was to come.
Classical composers in the 1950s and 60s decided to abandon not just the note system, but every other recognisable feature of Western music, declaring that any sound, such as the rubbing of sandpaper, could be described as music. All of the activities you see here were put on as actual musical performances, no kidding. But it wasn't as if there was no method at all in this madness. Often the only way to see or hear things afresh is to do away with the old and traditional. But audiences, in their masses, didn't get the new sounds and concepts. They held on stubbornly to the familiar inherited forms. For their part, the musical avant-garde celebrated their unpopularity. A dreadful impasse emerged. Classical music as a living, communicative language had, to all intents and purposes, ground to a halt. So by the time the Beatles arrived on the scene, practically the only new music anyone wanted to listen to was popular music.
Well, if you feel it and like it, go get your lover, then reel and rock it, roll it over.
But pop music in the 1950s, whilst often catchy, had its limitations too. It was formulaic, recycling the same few chords, song structures and rhythms again and again. Nothing that precedes the Beatles gives any clue as to the startling transformation they were about to set in motion. To understand fully how the Beatles rescued Western music, we have to know about something that had been around since the Renaissance: harmony. Or put simply, the chords that accompany a tune. Not only is Western harmony more rich, complex and versatile than its counterparts around the world, it has something in it that is unique. This is a kind of inner movement, a below-the-surface current that helps propel it along. And the way it works is like this. You take a simple tune like My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. You could, of course, just sing it on its own. My bonnie lies over the ocean, my bonnie lies over the sea. My bonnie lies over the ocean, oh, bring back my bonnie to me. Now, you could add one accompanying note, like you would in Indian music or in a bagpipe tune. My bonnie lies over the ocean, my bonnie lies over the sea. My bonnie lies over the ocean, oh, bring back my bonnie to me. But if you add Western chords, not only does it sound more friendly and warmer, it also gives it a kind of inner movement that pushes it along more purposefully. My bonnie lies over the ocean, my bonnie lies over the sea. My bonnie lies over the ocean, oh, bring back my bonnie to me. And the reason for that is the way that chords, by their very nature, group themselves together in familiar and effective patterns. Not only that, but some chords are magnetically drawn towards other chords, giving a sense of progression and development. These progressions and patterns have been exploited time and time again by composers across the centuries, from Bach to Puccini. In the 20th century, though, all that began to change. Classical composers got bored with the old sounds and dumped those cosy Western harmonies. What the Beatles did was to rescue those old familiar patterns discarded by the modernists and put them to use in pop music. They discovered that the full potential of Western harmony was still waiting there on tap, ready to be opened up and relished. It was like changing to colour TV after years of black and white. At first, they used the same simple 3 or 4 chords everyone else in pop knew, as for example in I Saw Her Standing There. Well, she was just 17, you know what I mean. But the way she looked was way beyond compare. But very soon they went beyond that, finding that chords have a complex interlocking system of their own. They have what you might call gravitational fields around them, whereby one chord might set off a chain reaction in other chords. Bad composers simply pick the first chord that comes into their head that seems to fit with the tune. Should all acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should all acquaintance be forgot for the sake of auld lang syne? But good composers sniff around for ages trying to find that perfect chord to fit the tune. Should all acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should all acquaintance be forgot for the sake of auld lang syne? But really good composers go one better. They don't just pick a nice chord to fit the melody, they instinctively know how to chain chord sequences together to provide a whole new dimension, a new layer of movement to the song. I Saw Her Standing There, written in 1962, has 4 chords in it. I Am the Walrus, written by John Lennon in 1967, has 16, juxtaposed with each other to create the aural effect of a shifting, unstable landscape. There are 8 in the intro alone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And above that, the tune is going nowhere. It's like a police siren. I am he as you are me, and we are all together. But the chords are on a journey of their own. Every time they change, they alter their relative position to the tune. This has an effect of disorientating the listener. It's a musical mudslide. I am he as you are, he as we are, he and we are all together. See how they run like pigs from a gun, see how they fly. I'm crying. This harmonic undercurrent drives the song onwards. In the original recording from the film Magical Mystery Tour, complemented by the psychedelic imagery, the harmony glides and slithers all over the place throughout the song.
I am he as you are me, and we are all together. See how they run like pigs from a gun, see how they fly. I'm crying, sitting on a cornflake, waiting for the van to come. Corporation t-shirt, stupid bloody Tuesday, man, you've been a naughty boy.
Shifting the chords about underneath a tune can be made even more effective if you exploit their relationship with each other. Some chords, like some people, have a fatal attraction to other chords. This is particularly true if you add some new element to an otherwise quite innocent chord. This chord, for example, F major, is pretty innocuous on its own, but if you add an E flat to it, it becomes F7. An F7 is a wobbly chord. It really, really wants to make a move on another chord with whom it shares a flat, B flat. If you don't believe me, listen to this. It's the bit at the end of the verse of Hey Jude, where we reach an F chord on the word better. Then an E flat is added to it and it becomes F7. And then suddenly we all desperately want to move to B flat, which we do on the word pain. It's magic and it works. Then you begin to make it better. Anytime you feel the pain, hey Jude, refrain. Don't carry the world upon your shoulders. Here it is again. But don't you know that it's a fool who plays it cool by making his world a little colder? There's nothing accidental about good composing. Famous composers use tricks and devices like this all the time, quite deliberately, because they know it'll sound better that way, and because it adds power and depth to the song. As McCartney and Lennon's composing developed during the 60s, they increasingly borrowed techniques from the classical field to enrich their songs. One of these techniques has a dull name, modulation, but a very exciting effect. Everybody listening to that climactic moment in Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet feels a surging, swelling lurch in their stomach as the violins reach the top of that phrase. That's because the music actually is lifting. It's undergoing a huge change in its harmony. This is modulation, and romantic music would be nowhere without it.
Modulating means moving a piece of music's centre of gravity from one key area to another. It's like changing from one colour scheme to another, an effect in house design that can have dramatic consequences. In one room, you might have a complementary series of hues and shades, all based on the fundamental colour red. Everything in the room attempts to fit into the overall reddish atmosphere and look of it. We may love this red room dearly, but our mood is going to change when we pass through into the next room, which has a more yellowy character. So it is with musical keys. You can be pottering along in a perfectly lovely key with all the notes in the music complementing the fundamental keynote. But to effect a change of mood, colour and feeling, we can move to another key area with its own fundamental keynote. Modulating from key to key is only really possible in Western music, and it's an effect that has to be used with care and subtlety. A crude or badly handled modulation can be as ugly as the juxtaposition of two clashing colours in a room. Imagine a gorgeous song like Danny Boy, filled with cheesy modulations. Oh, Danny Boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses falling. It's you must go and I must bide. By the time the Beatles discovered mid-song key changes, classical music had long since abandoned them. McCartney, in particular, became intrigued by modulation as a device, but he seemed instinctively to know that the best modulations occur by stealth, where mood and colour change imperceptibly, as if by magic. It may surprise you to learn, for example, that in the cheerful, happy-go-lucky song Penny Lane, he pulls off clever, immensely satisfying key changes no less than 7 times, almost without you noticing. This is the work of a composer who really knows what he's doing.
Penny Lane, there is a barber showing photographs of every head he's had the pleasure to know, and all the people that come and go stop and say hello. On the corner is a banker with a motor car, the little children laughing him behind his back, and the banker never wears a mask in the pouring rain. Very strange. Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. There beneath the blue suburban skies I sit and meanwhile back.
What effect, then, does this modulation have on the song? Well, for one thing, it alters our perception of the chorus. Listen to what it sounds like without the modulation. And the banker never wears a mask in the pouring rain. Very strange. Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. It's fine, isn't it? But it's not very surprising. In the proper version, there's much more of a shift in gear as we move into the chorus. And the banker never wears a mask in the pouring rain. Very strange. Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. It is, of course, quite common in a pop song for the voice to rise up to a higher range for the chorus, to sound more celebratory, more frenzied, more desperate, or more passionate. And McCartney's voice does indeed rise predictably upwards for the chorus. Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. But here's the clever bit. While the voice is rising upwards for the chorus, the modulation is actually a downwards shift. Moving the key downwards has the subconscious effect of making us feel slightly wistful, as if the joy isn't a total joy, but a joy experienced at a slight remove from the events it portrays. Since the song is about McCartney's childhood memories of growing up in suburban Liverpool, this makes perfect emotional sense to us as we listen. There's one other byproduct of this downward shift. At the end of the chorus, we're forced to move back up a gear as the verse starts again. Because we're now modulating upwards, the incoming verse greets us like a new day, full of optimism and youth.
For a fish and finger pies in summer, meanwhile back behind the shelter in the middle of the roundabout, the pretty nurse is selling puppies from a tray, and though she feels as if she's in a play, she is anyway. Penny Lane, the barber shaves another customer.
A lesser writer than McCartney would have left it at that. But Penny Lane is about journeys into the past, down a street, through suburban Liverpool. And so the harmony goes on a journey too. In the very final chorus, McCartney surprises us once more and lets the harmony shift again, this time upwards into the chorus. And the result is gloriously celebratory.
Meanwhile, Penny Lane is in my ears and in my eyes. There beneath the blue suburban skies, Penny Lane.
Penny Lane is one of the most magical, life-affirming songs in the Beatles' repertoire. It also features a Baroque piccolo trumpet solo inspired by a Paul McCartney hearing one on a TV broadcast of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 2.
McCartney's thirst for knowledge and understanding of classical music was extremely influential in the Beatles' work. Divisions between classical and popular seemed to dissolve in their later recordings. In this respect, McCartney was way ahead of his time, anticipating a future that didn't recognise artificial barriers between musical styles. By finding buried treasure in music's past, the Beatles gave their songs depth. But they also taught a new generation of classical composers that the Western tradition, at that time being systematically dismantled, still had something to offer. I believe that the Beatles' exhilarating inventiveness and mass popularity proved to all composers that you could still take the basic elements of Western music and make something new and powerful out of it. I don't think it's a coincidence that the music of composers like Philip Glass, Arvo Pärt, John Tavener, John Adams, Steve Reich and Henryk Górecki is all affirmatively tonal. That is, it's made up of the familiar harmonic, melodic and rhythmic tools of the Western tradition. As a composer living now, I actually feel quite angry about the damage done to contemporary music by the classical avant-garde in the 50s and 60s. Like many musicians of my generation, I owe a debt of gratitude to the Beatles for throwing a lifeline to new, tonal music.
Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music.
The Beatles changed the course of all music in the 20th century, but none of them had had any formal musical education. How did they do it?
It's gotta be rock and roll music if you wanna dance with me.
Perhaps fate played a hand.
I have no kick.
They learnt their craft playing 6, 7, even 8-hour-long sets in Hamburg. They had to play everything, not just rock standards, but movie theme tunes, Broadway show numbers, folk songs, torch songs, novelty numbers, and music hall. So when they came to compose, they already had a kaleidoscopic musical palette to draw on. But this is what all great composers have done. Bach's music, for example, is a combination of his native German Baroque style, the Italian instrumental music of Vivaldi, and even the rhythms and harmonies of Louis XIV's French court at Versailles. The Beatles, like Bach, embraced musical styles and ideas from here, there and everywhere with unabashed enthusiasm. They didn't just regurgitate them either like a human jukebox. Whatever idioms they borrowed always ended up sounding somehow like them.
Let's all get up and dance to a song that was a hit before your mother was born.
One moment we're in a pre-war ballroom gliding down the stairs and singing a song Your Mother Should Know with its close harmony backing vocals and soft shoe shuffle lilt.
The next moment, we're invited to enjoy a Victorian circus attraction, complete with fairground steam organ and ringside drum rolls, in being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. They had the wit and versatility to pastiche a veritable cornucopia of old-fashioned musical forms. But it always sounded like the Beatles. The sheer variety and wealth of style inherent in their music is one reason why they are much more than just another 60s pop band.
Their ability to absorb influences can be seen clearly in one of their greatest songs. In 1966, they released a track that was different from any pop song anyone had heard before. This song was Eleanor Rigby, and nothing shows more dramatically how their style as composers was developing.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. Lives in a dream, waits at the window, wearing the face that she keeps in a jar by the door. Who is it for?
The song is beautiful and sinister at the same time. What's happening inside this music to produce so chilling and moving an effect on us? Why is it so different from everything else that was going on in 1966?
Well, for a start, it's not in a conventional key. If it were, it would sound like this. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. As it is, it actually sounds like this. Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. The subtle difference between those two melodies, the raising of the sixth, the semitone, gives away the fact that Eleanor Rigby is in what's called a mode. Modes preceded the major and minor keys that were introduced into Western music during the Renaissance. Like keys, each mode has its own particular flavour and texture. They began in ancient Greece and still have Greek names, and they're hardwired into the folk music of many cultures. Here's a modal tune. Are you going to Scarborough Fair? Parsley, sage, rosemary and thyme. Remember me to one who lives there. Once she was a true love of mine. Scarborough Fair is in the Dorian mode, the most common minor mode in all Anglo-Celtic folk music. It has a moody, melancholic atmosphere about it.
All the lonely people, where do they all come from?
Eleanor Rigby is an urban version of a tragic English folk ballad in the Dorian mode. Its flowing, meandering vocal line is reminiscent of church plainsong too. But its mood isn't fatalistically morose or drippy. There's an earthy energy and grit to it. I don't think for one moment Paul McCartney sat down and said, I'm going to write this in E minor Dorian. But he was an intuitive composer, and it felt right for the poetic imagery of the song.
Father Mackenzie, wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave. No one was saved, all alone.
It is without doubt one of the most brilliant and poignant songs ever written, and its tense, brooding soundscape isn't merely good luck. Even at 24 years old, Paul McCartney knew exactly what sound he was after.
Even the way Eleanor Rigby ends is unusual. The final two closing chords of a piece of music are known technically as a cadence, from the Italian word cadere, to fall. When in English poets talk about a dying fall, they mean a cadence. Eleanor Rigby's cadence, chord 2 to chord 1, was once very fashionable in the 14th century. Now, there are lots of types of cadence, but the most common by far in popular music is the perfect cadence, 5 to 1. But listen to these cadences from Lennon McCartney songs. Yesterday, I believe in yesterday. Or this one, She's Leaving Home. Or another, And I Love Her. All of these cadences are what's known as plagal cadences. What's odd about this is that plagal cadences are almost entirely absent from the music that Paul McCartney grew up with. They're nowhere to be found in the songs of Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, rock and roll generally, or the dance band music that his dad played, or the Hollywood movie musicals of the 40s that everyone knew, or even music hall. No, plagal cadences come from hymns. The old familiar Amen you used to hear in church is a classic plagal cadence. Amen.
When we hear a Lennon and McCartney song, we're often being affected by small cultural details and emotional associations like these, even though we don't realise it. When yesterday ends, it is a dying fall. It is an Amen.
Yesterday, love was
By re-establishing the link between modern urban music and archaic forms, the Beatles were enriching their songs and expanding our expectations as listeners at the same time. But their plundering wasn't just restricted to European music. It is well known that the Beatles, particularly George Harrison, were drawn to the mystic teaching of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, following him first to Bangor in Wales, then to Rishikesh in India. George was a diligent pupil of sitar maestro Ravi Shankar. The Beatles, led by Harrison, took Indian instruments and used their unusual non-Western sounds as layers in their recordings, mainly the sitar, the violin-like dilruba, the tabla drum, the four-stringed tanpura. But their interaction with Indian music wasn't just musical tourism. It was to have an effect on their writing that went far beyond the occasional use of sitar and tabla for a bit of exotic colour.
Here's a song originally written while the Beatles were on retreat in Rishikesh. It was called then Child of Nature. On the road to Rishikesh, I was dreaming more or less, and the dream I had was true. Yes, the dream I had was true. I'm just a child of nature. I don't need much to set me free. I'm just a child of nature. I'm one of nature's children. This John Lennon song resurfaced many years later on the Imagine album as Jealous Guy, complete with piano, guitar and strings, sounding just like a regular Western pop song. But its melodic shape gives away its true origin. Before the Maharishi period, John Lennon's tunes tended to be quite static, allowing the movement of the chords underneath the melody to give them their character and their interest. The opening of A Hard Day's Night, for example, has quite a simple static tune with interesting chord changes beneath it. It's been a hard day's night and I've been working like a dog. But as his competitive partnership with McCartney developed, John Lennon's tunes became more adventurous, and around the time of his encounter with both Indian culture and hallucinogenic drugs, his tunes acquire a distinctly pentatonic feel. Pentatonic scales are, bluntly, the ones that use just the black notes on a piano. Pentatonic music sounds oriental because it's so prevalent in Asian and Far Eastern music. The Bhupali rag in Indian classical music is pentatonic. Apart from two tiny ornamental notes, the whole Jealous Guy tune can be played on the black notes of a piano. It is completely pentatonic. I was dreaming of the past, and my heart was beating fast.
I began to lose control.
The shaping of the melody was one of the many ways that the Beatles responded creatively to Indian music.
I didn't mean to hurt you.
By fusing Western and Eastern idioms, the Beatles anticipated by 30 years the musical phenomenon of Bhangra that was to sweep through the popular mainstream. But it wasn't just their ability to absorb disparate influences that made them tower over the century. They transformed the whole environment in which music is made. What they got up to in the studio in the 1960s has shaped how people make music ever since. The crowning glory of the Beatles' revolution in music was their use of the studio. They turned it from a dull box where you try to capture your live sound as accurately as possible into a playground of musical experimentation. Ironically, it was classical music's avant-garde that was to play a key role in shaping the Beatles' attitude to the studio.
Think nothing. Wait until it becomes absolutely quiet inside of you. When you have reached that, start playing.
Prior to recording Revolver, their groundbreaking 1966 album, Paul McCartney attended avant-garde happenings in London and became fascinated by the output of composers such as Karlheinz Stockhausen and Luciano Berio. Stockhausen was even chosen by McCartney to be on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. It was through this connection that the Beatles became interested in experimenting with tape.
This concept wasn't particularly new in classical music circles, where musician engineers like the American John Cage had been splicing up magnetic tape and editing it back together in endlessly repeated loops since the early 1950s. But it was dramatically new for pop. By looping a short piece of recorded tape, the material loses its original identity and becomes rhythmic and hypnotic. Any sound sample, a bird cry, a machine, or a group of people laughing, for example, is mysteriously transformed by looping. But there was a big difference between what the Beatles were up to and what avant-garde composers were doing. For the classical experimentalists, it was enough simply to do the looping and listen to that as a performance on its own. For the Beatles, however, it was a means to creating a nightmarish or hallucinogenic soundscape within their highly imaginative songs.
These avant-garde techniques started turning up on Beatles records beginning with Revolver. From then on, along with their producer George Martin, the studio was to be their creative home.
But it was the final track on the album, Tomorrow Never Knows, which confirmed that the Beatles were now musical innovators of global importance. Nothing like the aural landscape of this song had ever been heard before. It's hard to overestimate the impact this track had when it was released. In the subsequent 40-odd years, our ears have been assailed by so many other anarchic sound collages and experiments that it can't sound as mind-blowing to us as it did then to the millions who bought this record expecting another jolly collection of love songs from the Fab Four. Suddenly, the Beatles were in startlingly new territory. Tomorrow Never Knows is John Lennon's attempt to capture the experience of an LSD trip in music. Radical idea number one.
The song's subject is the mystic writing of hip psycho guru Timothy Leary and a sacred text called the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Radical idea number two. It fused Indian musical elements with Western pop, merging sitar and tanpura with electric bass, electric and acoustic guitars, organ, distorted piano, and a specially retuned and studio-treated drum kit. By way of the long, regenerated note C held on the sitar throughout, it also welcomed back the first so-called drone into mainstream Western music since the Middle Ages. Radical idea number three.
Producer George Martin took Lennon's voice and in an attempt to evoke the sound of hundreds of distant murmuring and whispering Tibetan monks, applied an elaborate series of bizarre studio effects to it, some invented specifically for this song, like feeding the voice electronically through this, a Leslie cabinet. Leslie cabinets were originally designed for the electronic Hammond organ, taking the sound and swishing it about with spinning wheels. But no one had thought of putting a voice through it before. Radical idea number four. And radical idea number five was the McCartney-led use of tape loops, running on a chain of 5 additional machines mixed live onto the master track.
The Beatles were deep in uncharted waters, not just for pop, but for any kind of music. They took what they learnt from Tomorrow Never Knows and applied aspects of it, especially the reverse tape effects, to many of their other songs, particularly John Lennon's masterly Strawberry Fields Forever.
Strawberry strawberry fields.
The Beatles, by 1966, when it was released to a thunderstruck public, were easily the most famous people on the planet. They were also dangerously isolated, and they knew it.
Strawberry fields forever.
By breaking the mould of what a pop single could possibly have sounded like with this record, they were also entering a shadowy world where most of their songs explored the interplay between illusion and reality.
Hard to be someone, but it all works out. It doesn't matter much to me.
In their desire to portray in their music a subconscious, dreamlike world, the Beatles fundamentally altered the course of popular song along the way. The depth and the strangeness of this record and of the whole Sgt. Pepper project that was to follow, which further developed many of the same themes of loneliness and regression, they set a standard of invention and imagination that few, if any, have equalled since.
No one I think is in my tree.
Having given up live performances, they made films instead to accompany their records. Visually inventive and idiosyncratic, they complemented this new musical direction. In the decades since then, it has become clear that the impact of their work was even more profound than anyone believed at the time. Though many hate to admit it, this applies equally to music outside the pop field. All musicians, young and old, now live and work in the new musical mainstream the Beatles helped to create. It's through the Beatles and their passionate belief in it that we owe the dramatic comeback of the Western musical system. They began the process of healing the damaging rift between popular and classical music.
Yet even now there are those who say that if music has mass appeal, it can't also be music of great significance or depth. What the Beatles proved once and for all is that this idea is hopelessly, absurdly wrong. There are very, very few composers in history whose work changed all the music that followed it. Beethoven was one, Wagner was another. And I believe that posterity will add to their select ranks the Beatles, whose musical revolution and thrilling songs will rightly be regarded as one of the crowning glories of 20th century music.
Find out more about the genius of Lennon and McCartney and other 20th century composers by visiting the Howard Goodall 20th Century Greats website at channel4.com/culture. Next up, walk right into a Damien Hirst, Fours at the Tate Modern.